Welcome back to Embedded for episode 2, where I speak to journalists that have covered international stories from the places where they happened. In this week's episode, I'm going to be speaking with Antony Loewenstein. He's an Australian journalist that has covered the Israel-Palestine conflict for nearly 2 decades now. He has written for the New York Times, the Guardian, Haaretz, the Washington Post, the New York Review of Books, the Sydney Morning Herald, and the Australian, just to name a few. He has also written a number of books, including My Israel Question, Reframing the Israel-Palestine Conflict, and more recently, Pills, Powder and Smoke, Inside the Bloody War on Drugs. It's a fantastic book and I read it recently and it really delves deep into the devastating war on drugs and the effect it's had on countries around the world. Loewenstein actually travelled to countries like Honduras, the Philippines and Guinea-Bissau to cover how the drug war is affecting those countries. It's really interesting and I think everyone should read it. However, our discussion isn't going to be about that today. We're going to be talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict and his experience from living in the country for 4 years and travelling back and forth over the last 2 decades. Antony, strangely enough, has Jewish heritage, although he identifies as an atheist. And at the beginning of his reporting on Israel, he used to identify as a supporter of Israel. But now he's become one of its harshest critics. And his reporting got him in the crosshairs of the Israeli government, which attempted to push him out of the country when he was living in Jerusalem. And his journalism covering the crisis has also won him the 2019 Jerusalem Peace Prize, one of Australia's leading peace awards. In today's episode, we talk everything from his experiences living in Jerusalem to visiting Gaza many times, to as well as why he calls what is happening apartheid and Gulf normalization deals, as well as the US's role in the conflict. So keep listening for the full discussion. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Antony. How are you going today?
Pleasure. I'm going well. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for asking. So I want to get a sense of where you lived and your movements throughout the years, because we want to talk a lot about Israel and Palestine. And you've been in and out of Israel and Palestine a lot over the last 20 years or so. So can you talk to us a little bit about your movements?
So I grew up in Melbourne. I'm Jewish, although I'm an atheist Jew. That's how I describe myself. So I'm not religious at all. I don't believe in God, but I feel culturally Jewish. And how we define that is probably a conversation for another podcast. But I'm not religious at all. And when you grow up as a Jew, and I'm generalizing here, but it's pretty true, it's generally seen as necessary and vital that you support Israel, fairly uncritically.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was growing up, although Israel wasn't really a central part of our lives, I mean, my family never had any real connection to Israel per se, although the connection was, as for many Jews, that a lot of my family was killed in the Holocaust. Most couldn't get out of Europe. They tried, and it was too late. Some did get out and were scattered around the world, including in Australia and Canada and elsewhere. So Israel was seen for a long time as a potential safe haven if, God forbid, something like that happens again. And I suppose if you asked me when I was 10 or 12, I probably went along with that. I mean, I didn't know anything better. But I'd never been to Israel until 2005 was my first time. And although I had opportunities when I was younger, I think as a late teenager to go on, Jews have an opportunity to go on these things called birthright, which is basically a Zionist propaganda trip, essentially, to try to convince you of how great Israel is. I think another aim, which is less talked about, is they want you to partner up with somebody Jewish. It could be male or female. I mean, not that I'm saying they want you to have babies and marry at 18 necessarily, but that is a central reason for birthright. And they say that because many in the Jewish establishment are worried that more and more Jews are marrying out or having kids with non-Jewish partners. And that for them is a problem. It's not a problem for me because that's how I'm living my life, but it's a problem for some people. So I first went in 2005 and I was already pretty critical and skeptical. I wasn't where I am now on the issue. I've evolved. And I went there for the first time because I was researching my first book, My Israel Question.
Mm-hmm. And since then, you've been back and forth a lot. And then you lived in Palestine for a few years?
I did. So since 2005, I've been going roughly every 3 or so years for a story, for a new book, for whatever it may be. I would stay for anywhere between 3 weeks and a couple of months. And in 2016, I moved to East Jerusalem and was there till early this year, 2020. About a year of that time, I came back to Australia for family reasons. But other than that, I was based in Jerusalem.
Okay, and from living in Jerusalem, you're in East Jerusalem, which is internationally recognized as Palestinian area. How did living there affect your views on the whole Palestine-Israel conflict?
If you live in East Jerusalem, you don't get angry a lot. You're blind. I'm not saying I was going into fits of rage all the time. I don't mean it like that. I mean that I regularly saw down the road from my house Israeli soldiers harassing, humiliating, intimidating Palestinian youth. I didn't see anybody killed, but I saw that happening all the time. It's normal. It is ubiquitous. It is deeply held racist views by a majority Israeli Jewish population there. And so, although I had obviously seen evidence of that sort of thing for many years, I was reading about it and saw it with my own eyes, whether it was in Israel, the West Bank, or Gaza, places I've been to, all of them in the last 15 years. I guess living amongst it, I was living in East Jerusalem with my partner, and I guess we chose there for a few reasons. For someone who might not understand the difference, West Jerusalem is predominantly Jewish and East Jerusalem is predominantly Palestinian. There's no border, so to speak. Like if you go between Israel and say the West Bank, there are checkpoints and there's a wall and etc. But between East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, you don't need a passport, you don't need a document. You can go back and forth in your car or public transport or walk, but there's a massive cultural difference. So we felt, my partner and I, that we wanted to live in East Jerusalem amongst and alongside the people who are suffering the most. I mean, we were living in a nice area in East Jerusalem, but as far as East Jerusalem goes, wasn't a mansion, I mean, but it was, it was a nice area. But what I mean is that we wanted to live with the people there who are occupied. We didn't want to live with the occupiers. And that's not hugely uncommon for journalists who I respect. In other words, some places where you live in a city, it's not political where you live, right? If you lived in, say, I mean, obviously there's always different issues in different areas of every city, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, whatever, of course. But in general, this is not as much of the case as it is in, say, Jerusalem. So it's important for me and my partner and a number of other journalists that I know to live in East Jerusalem for that reason.
And while you're there, moving from East Jerusalem to West Jerusalem, is there checkpoints? Like, is it easy to get across?
There's no checkpoints. You can go back and forth. If you're Palestinian, you can go back and forth. Having said that, when you're in West Jerusalem, if you are Arab or Palestinian, you don't see many of them. Like, it really is a very divided society. In East Jerusalem, you rarely see Jewish people. You see some tourists that are having a look around. You see increasing amounts of Jewish extremist settlers who are essentially trying to colonize Palestinian land. We had a settlement being built not that far from our house. You do see in West Jerusalem, if you do see Arabs or Palestinians, they're often building the houses. And of course, in the West Bank, the greatest irony and tragic irony is the settlements themselves, which are what are essentially killing any chance of an independent Palestine, are regularly and mostly built by Palestinians. So essentially they are being forced, because of the economic disaster that is the West Bank and Palestine, to be building their own destruction, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
They're not doing it willingly or happily. They're doing it to earn a living to support their family, assuming they can get a job at all. So, but no, between East and West Jerusalem, there are no checkpoints.
Okay. But also since living there, you've written a lot about apartheid and comparisons with South African apartheid. When did you start, believing and seeing this kind of stuff, and when did that become part of your worldview in Palestine, that apartheid is still happening, or it is happening in Israel and Palestine as we speak?
If you heard me speak and read my first book, My Israel Question, I was not using that language at all. In fact, if I go back to 2005, 6, I would say I support a two-state solution. I think I said I was a Zionist. I was a very critical one, but that's what I would have said at the time. My views have changed a lot since then. I can't remember exactly what brought me to use the term apartheid. I think people often see it simply as a rhetorical device. It's not that. It is a term known in international law, which clearly explains that one people racially are ruling another by force or without consent. And what's happening in Palestine, particularly the West Bank and Gaza, but also East Jerusalem, is a potentially minority now population. In fact, no one knows exactly when this has happened, but demographically, we think now that there is a minority of Jews ruling over a majority of Palestinians. So by definition, that's apartheid. In other words, demographically, although the numbers are contested, it's likely that is the case. I suspect I started using those terms in the last decade or so. In 2012, I co-edited a collection called After Zionism with a Palestinian American, Ahmed Moore, who I think is now based in Jordan, as far as I know. And that was really a collection of essays by Palestinians, by Jews, by others, about what a one-state solution would look like and how to almost de-Zionize Israel-Palestine. So I'd come a long way from 2006 saying, I'm a Zionist and I support Israel and its right to exist, but there should be a Palestinian state. And that journey in some ways is not an uncommon one for many Jews who grew up. I mean, some people obviously go from in a different, I guess, they go in a quicker direction than I did. But I got there relatively quickly. And I suppose that was partly spending time over there, and the success of my book and that work around Israel-Palestine meant, and I was based in Sydney then, that I was spending a lot of time with Arabs and Palestinians. And I don't doubt that their views inform mine. I was reading a lot more about the conflict. And I was visiting there, I guess. I think I'd visited there. I was there in mid-2009, which was 6 months after Operation Cast Lead, which was the first of the three. I mean, there's countless Israeli wars against Gaza in the last 15 years, but the first of the three major conflicts between Israel and Hamas. And so the bombs were not falling when I was there, but much of Gaza had been flattened. And you see Palestinians living literally in rubble. I was there in summer, in the Israeli-Palestinian summer, so it was bloody hot there. It's like desert for temperatures for 6 months of the year, 30, 35, 40 degrees. And it was just literally suburbs had been flattened by Israeli missiles and bombs. And I think that was certainly very important in my evolution towards the position that I was moving towards and what I have now.
Okay, and that's something I really want to get into a bit later, like the future of Palestine and Israel. But you touched on going to Gaza. What was that like, with your first experiences there? And you were there a bit more recently as well. And when was that?
So the first time I went there, as I said, I think it was mid-2009.
Yeah.
And I've been there a number of times since. The last time I was there now was probably around 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I was doing reporting there. I had gone there from living in Jerusalem, and people probably don't realize, because there's a sense when you see media coverage that Israel's kind of here and Gaza is, I don't know, far away or whatever. The truth is, from Jerusalem, from our house, it's an hour and a quarter drive.
Wow, really?
I mean, the distances there are unbelievably short, but one of the really sort of mind-bending realities is the fact that you do go from so-called normal Jerusalem, and obviously that's said with the caveat because under occupation where we were living, but compared to Gaza it is, you drive an hour and a quarter, hour and a half to the massive Israeli checkpoint called Erez. It's a huge warehouse checkpoint. There is a fence, massive fence. you as a journalist or aid worker, I mean, I'm not an aid worker, but the only people who are allowed into Gaza these days, it's essentially closed off. It has been for since 2006-7. Journalists can get in there, NGO workers can get in there, the UN. There are some other exceptions, but in general, it's cut off from the world. And going there, it has an incredibly different feel to the West Bank. It's on the Mediterranean, and it's actually very beautiful. One of the things that really struck me about Gaza, yes, it's often desperate and poor. I'm not minimizing that for a second, but it's like my thought years ago when I went to Afghanistan a number of times, that when people think about these places, because how the media portrays them, the perception is Gaza must be this hellhole, and Afghanistan similarly, obviously very different contexts. And there clearly both places are deeply troubled, of course, but they're actually also incredibly beautiful. Afghanistan is probably more beautiful than Gaza, but Gaza being on the Mediterranean is really quite a striking, beautiful place. And the people there, I've really seen or met of people who are, I mean, the term resilient is such a cliche, but they've kind of been through hell.
Yeah.
And they're still living that hell now. There's no indication the blockade of Gaza by Israel and Egypt's going to end anytime soon. A potential Biden administration in the US, it gives no indication of that really changing at all, that particular issue. And if Trump wins a second term, well, what can one say about that? Maybe we can talk more about that later if you'd like. But Gaza's I wish more journalists went there. And the problem is Israel often doesn't let main journalists in there. So it's partly because they don't want a lot of journalists to go in there.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that. How was to get into Gaza, what do you have to do? Do you have to apply for special visas as a journalist? And do they take into account that you're very pro-Palestine or your opinions as well, and with giving you a visa to get in?
Officially, no, but unofficially, absolutely. I mean, of course, if you ask them, they'll say, no, your opinions are irrelevant. What is your track record? What have you done? Have you published with? Israel's increasingly cracking down on freelance journalists in general. So they much prefer, I mean, they want no one to go to Gaza at all. But if you are with New York Times, CNN, major news organizations around the world, you probably won't have trouble getting in. You have to apply for a permit. The permit will last for a set amount of time, and you also need to apply. So that's obviously with the Israeli press office, it's called. But you also need to apply for a Hamas visa, a Hamas entry visa, and before you arrive, because when you enter, it's a really crazy, strange environment. You essentially get into this huge warehouse, into this incredible security. They have no problem you getting in. They're happy when you get there. They kind of say, off you go. I mean, of course, I have to say a number of times when I got there, the Israeli soldier behind this glass would say to me, "Oh, Loewenstein, is that a Jewish name?" "Yes." "Why are you going in there? What are you crazy? What do you, I mean, the image is literally that I'm going to be lynched the moment I get in. That is the image. It's the image around much of the Israeli community. It's the image in much of the Jewish community globally. And I'm not suggesting there's no threats. There are. But I didn't feel unsafe there. If anything, I felt more unsafe from Israeli attack. Not on me particularly, but just on Gaza itself. I mean, there's no doubt there is an extreme ISIS-like fringe in Gaza. They are crazy. They make Hamas seem very moderate. And they would go after someone like me as a Western Jewish journalist. But nonetheless, I didn't feel threatened when I was there the times I visited. But you also need to get a Hamas visa, and you get that by having a contact in Gaza who helps you get that through Hamas officials. It's just what you need. It's fairly standard. Look, Hamas is also not a big fan of journalists either, to be honest. So.
Okay. And having a Jewish last name, do you get any pushback from Hamas because of that?
My sense was that they mostly didn't realize. I obviously didn't advertise that I was Jewish, probably because they may have thought, who knows, you're an Israeli spy, or I mean, that fear is there. I mean, to the Western ear, Loewenstein's a very Jewish name, or certainly if one speaks English, it sounds pretty Jewish. Not an overly common name, but it's not that uncommon. But I found traveling through a lot of the Muslim world, which I've done, that there have been times where people have said to me, do you worry about that last name, that you may be, wrong place, wrong time, in a place like Afghanistan or elsewhere? I mean, I've never thought seriously about changing my name. But
But
no,
it seems like you get more threats from Israeli people than you do from anyone concerned about your last name. Sure.
or very hardline pro-Israel types in the West.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And one last thing with Gaza. You said you went in 2009. Was that before Operation Cast Lead?
That was after. Castle Ed was basically in 2008, early 2009, as Obama was about to take office for the first time. So I was there in mid 2009.
Was it anything to do with Obama taking office, or just?
Well, absolutely. There was evidence to suggest that he basically, of course, he wasn't officially president. Obviously, it was George W. Bush, and it was transitioning to Obama. The inauguration was January 20, as it always is, as it'll be next January. And there's evidence to suggest that Obama's people wanted that war to be over by the time his inauguration began.
Right. So they really pushed through in that
But
brief period of
essentially, they
time.
gave Israel support to do what it wanted to do
Yeah.
before that would be quiet, so the inauguration would be given the airtime that he wanted. So
As
there's
Israelis,
evidence for that.
as they would call it, mowing the grass.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So, and your last time going to Gaza was a few years ago. So, how have you seen Gaza change over the periods of time that you've been there? Has it, like, of course, it's been getting worse and worse as the blockade's been going on, but now things are really getting bad, I guess. And there's every few years there's another bombing campaign by Israel. So, how has it changed on the ground? And the buildings that you used to stay in, or like the hotels, have they, most of them still standing, or like how bad is all this?
Well, the hotel that I've stayed at most times I've been there actually has still exists. Obviously, tourism in Gaza is pretty minimal these days, and my partner used to visit not the same time as me, but she would go in there. She worked for an NGO, and she was staying at, when I say quite a nice hotel, I mean, we're not talking about 5 stars here, but there actually had been nice hotels for the hope years ago that Gaza could be a tourist destination. I know it sounds crazy now, but actually it's not out of the realm of possibility. You fast forward 10, 20 years, I don't know how the politics changes. It's on the Mediterranean, on the beach. So, you can join the dots. I mean, there's no reason why it couldn't be, aside from the fact there's not much infrastructure and it's a blockade, etc. But how's it changed? People are more desperate. They're angrier. They are more disillusioned. More and more people want to leave, although most of them can't, either through Egypt or leaving via Israel is almost impossible. Leaving via Egypt is bloody difficult. They border on the other side, Rafah, which Westerners can't enter Gaza that way, but Palestinians can leave via that way if, well, either pay a bribe to the Hamas guard to let them out when the border's open, which is rare. You see, what else have I seen? I saw unemployment just skyrocketing, getting worse all the time. Water supply, much of it, the water is poisonous. There's huge diseases associated with dirty water. As a outsider, you drink, bottled water or filtered water. Some locals do as well. But the water that people are swimming in the Mediterranean, which is very beautiful, is polluted. I mean, and the crazy thing is, when you're on, I didn't swim in that water for that very reason. I didn't want to go in polluted water, but I understand why people living there do, because that's the option. There is no alternative, so it is what it is. And especially if you've got a young family in summer, you want to go to the beach, right, and have fun with the kids. But what's so surreal about being there is seeing, when you're standing on the beach in Gaza, literally on the horizon, you see the Israeli city next to the border on the Israeli side. on the horizon, sparkling because the electricity is normal, the power is on all the time, because many people might not realize that in Gaza, you might get 4 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, 2 hours electricity a day. That's it. So you can do the maths what that means practically. In summer, you are roasting if there's no power. Yes, some people have got generators, but obviously that requires you having fuel to power that generator. And in winter, you're bloody freezing. I mean, Gaza gets incredibly cold, and it's disturbing how many people in winter are dying from candles burning over, kids getting terrible burns because there's no electricity. I mean, the levels of sickness and trauma there. And I think also just finally, it's a deeply traumatized society. I'm not suggesting people can't laugh and have fun, but I'm saying that in general, people have been under this inhumane blockade. And people also say, they're sick of saying it, but they do say, like, the world's forgotten us. I mean, let's be frank, the world doesn't care. I mean, when we say the world, I'm talking about the major powers. The Arab countries don't give a shit. I'm not talking about the Arab people, I'm talking about the Arab leaders. They don't care. The US, well, we know where the US stands, especially under Trump, and other leaders too, for that matter. The European Union is weak beyond belief. Who's going to help here? I mean, who's going to raise their voice? There are other countries around the world, yes, who are critical of what Israel does. They've got no power to do a damn thing about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a pretty sad state of affairs.
Yeah, of course. Okay, and when you heard about the normalization deals with the UAE and Bahrain, what was your reaction to all that? Did you see this coming?
Farce. I mean, it's a farce. Did I see it coming? Not necessarily when it happened. I mean, I thought it was likely to probably happen. Whether it was going to happen at the end of the Trump administration first term, of course, I didn't know, but I wasn't overly surprised. I mean, it's really, it signifies the utterly cynical relationship that Israel under Netanyahu has with growing numbers of Arab states. That two things. One, they choose to frame their joint interests as against Iran, who they apparently fear. I think that's questionable, but they say that they fear Iran. And secondly, much of the Arab world wants access to amazing Israeli weapons and technology. So everybody's happy. And also Israel can then get, frankly, more votes potentially in the UN Security Council or elsewhere. And I mean, ultimately, if the Palestinian leadership, who are utterly useless and corrupt, needed any more evidence that help is not coming. I mean, this is the dire state that we're in here now. Help is not coming from the Arab leadership of pretty much any country. And even the nations that are friends with Israel, Jordan and Egypt. I mean, look at Egypt is enforcing the blockade against Gaza. It's run by a horrible dictator, Sisi. Jordan is run by a pretty brutal, also King Hussein, who sort of mouths things about, oh, the occupation should end. But, I mean, A, won't do anything about it, and B, is much happier and prefers to receive $2 billion of US aid every year, which essentially is what they get to keep, Jordan and Egypt are paid by America to not go to war with Israel. That's what the peace deal decades ago, in 94 with Jordan and late 70s with Egypt, was always about. Always has been. So the latest normalization deals are depressing. Look, there's no doubt many Israelis I know, Israeli Jews are pleased to the extent that they might feel less threatened, if they did feel threatened, by these Arab states. I mean, the UAE was not really ever threatening Israel, to be honest. I mean, they never had a war or anything, neither was Bahrain. I mean, I think the idea of Saudi kissing and hugging Israel is only a matter of time. Would that happen if Biden becomes president? Hard to say, but there's a degree of inevitability here about it. Arab leaders are not Palestinians' friends. Never have been.
Mm.
And yeah, so it was farce.
Yeah, I understand. I just wanted to ask you about, so you said, we touched on earlier that your opinions on pushing for a one-state solution or a two-state solution has changed, where initially you supported a two-state solution, Palestine and Israel living side by side. But now you support a one-state solution. But I hear a lot of the problem with that, and I've heard a lot of pro-Palestinian people talk about how Israel would never allow a one-state solution because of the population of Palestine, and they would be able to outvote the Jewish population or the Israeli population. So how do you see, a one-state solution eventuating and getting to a point where it would encompass Palestinians and Palestinian votes?
The shorter answer today and tomorrow, it won't.
Yeah.
The longer term, though, and I say that, it's obvious to say, but what I mean is that issue you raised is absolutely how the vast majority of Israeli Jews feel, and for that matter, majority of Jews in the diaspora. I mean, if you ask how many Jews in the diaspora support a one-state solution where Israel is no longer the dominant force, you're not going to get heaps of support. It is changing in the US, I have to say. The young Jewish community is much more progressive and pro-Palestinian than any generation before. But that changes for a few reasons. One, over time, I feel like it's a long way away, but I fear over time, there is a campaign that I think will have to be run by a decent Palestinian leadership, which is not the one they currently have now, for one person, one vote. Like literally what democracy means is we live in this place, we got to vote. It's really quite simple. Israel refuses to allow that for the obvious reason is that potentially, God forbid, Arabs or Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza could vote for someone in the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament. I mean, God forbid. I mean, that's the framing of it. And I think in time, a one person, one vote is the only way that Palestinians in Palestine, but also globally, will get growing international support to say, are we going to, as a world, tolerate a nation, Israel, which indefinitely occupies or treats Palestinians as second-class citizens? And yes, a lot of Palestinians say Israel will never accept. Israel may have no choice but to accept it. South African apartheid is an interesting comparison here. It didn't go from one day to the next. It's suddenly white South Africans went, oh, we're oppressing these blacks. You really better do something about this. The world essentially gave them an option. I don't think the world was going to invade their country necessarily, but they said, you're either going to be welcomed into the community of the world or you're going to be shunned. Now, it took a long time to get to that point and it took decades. And one of the countries that supported South Africa till the end was Israel, I might add. One of the last allies of apartheid South Africa was Israel, which speaks volumes about they saw both countries saw a lot of they admired in the other. I mean, it's been written about for a long time. So I do think in time, Israel will have no choice but to not to. I mean, my vision for what one state is not necessarily. I mean, ideally it would be a secular state. Now, obviously, ultimately, that's not my decision. But to me, I'd love it to be a secular state. If you want to be Jewish or Muslim or atheist or Hindu, whatever you are, fine. Now, you could argue if the majority of people are Muslim, which would be Palestinians, is it likely to be a Muslim state? Possibly. Is that something I personally would like? Well, it's not really my decision. But, I mean, to me, the only way a viable one-state solution can happen, which is what happened in the transition in South Africa in 94, was that, and again, there are differences and similarities, that whites were essentially assured that they were not going to be, well, I would argue, held to account for what happened.
Yeah. Or lose their status either.
Yes. And of course, you could argue very convincingly that apartheid never ended in South Africa, to be honest. I mean, the situation there is grim. Apartheid has continued for the vast bulk of the black population. It's not called apartheid, and the ANC is black who run the country. I'm aware of that. But it is still apartheid in South Africa in so many ways. And South African friends of mine sort of say, a lot of people who you speak to there will say, nothing has changed for us since the supposed transition in the mid-90s. And
Yeah.
I think at the moment in Israel-Palestine, that feels very, very hard to imagine. But the one person, one vote campaign is growing in support amongst Palestinians, both within Palestine and globally. And it's inevitable that the Palestinian leadership in Palestine, I'm talking about Mahmoud Abbas or even Hamas, these parties and groups are never going to be the ones bringing freedom to Palestine, ever. It's not going to happen. I mean, it's conceivable that one of them will sign some peace deal at some point on some White House lawn. It's possible, not with Donald Trump in charge, but with Joe Biden. Yeah, it's possible. But it's not going to address almost certainly the issues that need to be addressed to not bring justice. So on that level, I'm pretty pessimistic in the short term for the Palestinian leadership, but longer term, a bit less so.
I think most people that follow the Palestinian cause would probably say the same thing, unfortunately. I just want to touch on as well, like I have a couple more questions. I know we didn't have much time left, but you've also written a lot about Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister for now of Israel. And just like Trump, you've written that Netanyahu is a symptom of the disease. He's not the cause of the problems. So like a lot of people say that about Trump. So can you explain a bit about why you say that about Netanyahu?
So Netanyahu, to be clear, is a terrible, racist, awful human being and deeply corrupt who I would like to see in jail for his multiple crimes. Less so the corruption and apparently loving champagne and nice food and then occupying Palestinians and increasing settlements. I mean, that to me is the greater crime than liking champagne. Not that I'm excusing taking gifts from rich people, but that to me is far less of a problem in my view than what his government, as the most right-wing government in Israel's history, has entrenched the occupation. That to me is the crime, or the bigger crime. And the reason I talk about that with Netanyahu or Trump for that matter, as you say, is that many people, I think, mistakenly believe that you get rid of a leader, either they resign, they lose an election, whatever it may be, and there is somehow almost a cleansing of society and a new leader comes up who's likely to hopefully bring change. And that's a lovely thought, but in Israel, there literally is no viable leader in the Israeli political system who has any chance of winning an election who's any better. So the person who's potentially likely to replace him, Netanyahu, will fall at some point, either through corruption or an election or whatever, this year, next year. I mean, God, he's been going for a long time, hasn't he? But at some point, he's going to lose the election or lose power. Naftali Bennett is far more right-wing, far more racist. This is the likely alternative in Israel. And in the US, for example, again, yes, when the time is broadcast, we may well know who became US president. So we're kind of guessing at this stage. Yeah. But there's a real sense that anyone who understands, for example, the desperate need in America for racial justice would be pretty nervous about Joe Biden being president. Now, clearly, there is a desperate need to get rid of Trump. Don't get me wrong. But Joe Biden's record in the last 40 years is utterly woeful when it comes to mass incarceration, deep racism against blacks and minorities. I mean, his record is clear on that. He may still win the election because Trump is seen as far worse. And I understand that completely. So one of the things, my thinking about Netanyahu has very much been informed by Gideon Levy, who's a good friend and an Israeli journalist, one of the finest. And he has regularly he writes for Haaretz, which is, I guess, a sort of liberal Israeli newspaper in Hebrew and English. And his journey is also fascinating, by the way. Years ago, he would have called himself, he was very pro-Zionist, and now he calls for BDS and, he supports sanctions against Israel. So he's a fascinating example of how, whereas Israel has mostly moved very much to the far right, Gideon's moved very much the other direction for a range of different reasons, which makes him on one level a bit of an outsider in his own society. He lives in Tel Aviv. But his thinking on this is really inspired mine and helped me, because he sort of says, at the moment, for example, in the last months, there's been massive protests in Israel against Netanyahu, huge. talking about his corruption, getting rid of him, and that's all fantastic. But there's only two problems with it. One, Palestinians are never talked about, never mentioned, never invited to join, never really involved. So it's a very Zionist pro-Israel movement. And two, it's all about decapitating Netanyahu. What's the vision the next day? Who's the leader? What are the policies? Will they be any different? Simply putting someone else in charge who's roughly the same changes nothing. That's, to me, is the danger. And I think there is an obsession in much of the West on leaders. Leaders matter. I'm not minimizing that. Someone can be a demagogue and very dangerous and can do horrible, horrible things. But I worry that there's too much of a focus on just getting rid of a particular leader rather than looking at the broader picture of what that leader represents and how common their views are across the society.
It's interesting that, like, you know, you say all that, but, you know, if someone wasn't paying close attention, we could have been talking about the US or Israel. You know, no one really would have picked up on that, you know. And it's unfortunate that, you know, a lot of people, I think, in the US, they see the same thing. As soon as Trump's gone, they can go back to not caring about politics anymore, which is an unfortunate.
Well, that's what
place to
happened
be.
during the Obama years.
Exactly.
I mean, during the Obama years, people kind of switched off, despite the fact that, yes, he wasn't George W. Bush, and thank God for that. But Obama, on a lot of issues that I write about and care about and report on, was an absolute disaster. Massively increased drone strikes, gave Israel its biggest aid deal in history, did absolutely nothing to change the occupation, made some nice speeches, but did bugger all, pretty much typical Obama. There were some issues domestically that Obama did on drug policy. My last book talked about that. So he wasn't all a disaster, but in general, yeah, people need to, I think, be aware that when their guy or woman takes over, don't switch off. Don't suddenly... And, you know, it's interesting, even Obama, the last few days, as he's campaigning for Joe Biden, has kind of still said that. He basically said, don't you, Americans, want a leader that you just don't have to think about them. They just kind of go about the job. You don't have to worry about it. Now, on the one hand, sure, after Trump and the shit show that is Donald Trump, I kind of get that. But this idea that's sort of really not even implicit, but explicit is, just let them do their own thing. What does that even mean? I mean, Obama comes into power in 2009, at the time, the worst economic crisis for decades, has prosecuted literally nobody who was the cause of that, and gave a bailout to all the people who caused the problems in the first place. So nothing really changed. Yes, you got the economy off its knees, sure, but that's the danger that we're going to face now when the pandemic has actually caused even more economic crisis, and there's going to be a need for unbelievably huge amounts of money to get the country back on its feet. If Trump wins a second term, how that plays out is, the administration said the last few weeks that they've accepted the fact that they're not going to control the virus, and the mentality now is we're waiting for a vaccine. Okay, well, I hope the vaccine comes, and we all do, so we can live our normal-ish lives and travel again. That'd be great. I'll hopefully get one myself, but fingers crossed for next year. But how about between now and then? America is going through a winter, as is Europe for that matter, and there's potentially going to be hundreds of thousands of more deaths. And the administration says, well, we just have to live with it. Wow. I mean, the fact that knowing that Trump could still potentially win is mind-blowing.
Yeah, well, I think it's got a lot to do with, the news in America. Like, whoever you follow is just a massive influence on your politics. And that's what so my final question is, of course, about journalism in 2020. And you're very critical of a lot of journalists, and like a lot of liberal journalists, which make up the majority, especially in the US. A lot of them don't criticize Obama, and they're very careful with talking how they talk about Israel. Do you see that as being
Yes.
Do you notice all this stuff and you see it as being a big problem?
Yes, huge problem.
And why do you think that is?
So I guess on one level it's hard to generalize, Nick. On the other hand, I would say that in general, the majority of journalists you would speak to will say, our job, and I'll paraphrase what they'll say, is to question authority and challenge it, or something like that, probably. Whether they're based in Canberra or London or Washington or somewhere else. And obviously there are some journos in all those places that do a really good job. There are even some good Murdoch journos. They do exist here and there. But in general, the majority of journalists actually want to be part of the club. And being part of the club, and Glenn Greenwald has talked a lot about this over the years, and it's one reason amongst many that I have a lot of time for him, is that most journalists, when it comes down to it, want to be in the right parties. And it sounds sort of twee to say that, but there are certain kinds of views that you generally don't express. For example, why do we think that in the last decade, WikiLeaks partnered with some of the biggest media organizations in the world, Guardian, New York Times, and others? They've let him out to dry, the Guardian particularly, in fact, the so-called liberal progressive Guardian. I mean, it's utterly shameless. And now, yes, there are some journalists who speak out in support of him, and I certainly am one of them. Not because I think he's perfect and WikiLeaks was perfect. I don't, although I've been supporting them since 2006, the beginning. But what's at threat in the case against Assange to face potentially being sent to the US to basically be put in a supermax prison and therefore die there is so profound, and yet the case barely got any media attention, and that is about being part of the club. There's been such a demonization campaign against Assange for years that the majority of journalists just say, I'm not going to go there. And Israel-Palestine is very similar. Very, very similar. There are exceptions. There are good journos who do say and understand the reality. But for a lot of people, it's simply, I would say, very cynical career management. Are they thinking of it like that? Hard to know. But ultimately what the majority of journalism I see happen on a daily basis, and that includes here in Australia, the US, and the UK, it's not journalism, it's stenography. It's essentially rewriting a press release. Either something literally has been sent out to the general public, which most of us don't see because, we're not on that email list from whatever government department or business, or it's a sanctioned leak, right? Meaning that journalist X is mates with an advisor to this politician and they get a story in there. I see that stuff all the time. This is not just the Murdoch press, by the way. I see it in the Guardian as well. And the Guardian does some great stuff, don't get me wrong. But I see it in the Guardian as well all the time. It's like Labor politician gives speech. We just basically print the speech as a news story. That's not a news story. That's not a news story. You can say, if Scott Morrison gives a speech as Prime Minister, I understand that should be news because what he says has impact. I don't like him at all. But obviously it's like Donald Trump. You can't ignore them. I mean, they lead the country and what they say matters. Yeah, I just think ultimately I really often encourage young journalists to get into the industry, if you can call it that. But it makes sense that the majority of them follow a very traditional path, assuming they can find work at all, because the industry is in very bad shape. But assuming they can, you're not going to be outspoken on certain things because you worry about what people are going to say about you on Twitter, or you worry what a potential future employer says. Now, I'm not saying one should ignore all that, but I'm saying, and I feel like for me, over the years, about 15 years I've been a journalist, I kind of have a foot in the mainstream and a foot in the alternative press. And it's sort of often an uneasy relationship, whereas I release a book or I do a film or I do stories and I often want them to be read. So I will sometimes do stories in outlets I might not love, but you do it because you want to reach an audience. But I also regularly get interviewed by the independent press, call it whatever you want, here and around the world on lots of issues. And whether it's Palestine or disaster capitalism or whatever, or drugs. And I also want to reach that audience too. Now, whether most people kind of have a foot in one camp or the other, and I've tried to do both. How successful I've been, I guess people can make that assessment, but that's what I try to do.
Okay. My very, very final question now is, so all these journalists that you speak about that are in the club, what are they going to do with all their time if Biden wins?
You mean in the US or just in general?
In general, in the US, really. They'll have a lot more free time on their hands, I presume.
Well, yes and no. I mean, America is kind of on its knees at the moment, isn't it? So they're going to
Yeah.
have a chance to report on that. I mean, it's going to be the shenanigans of assuming Trump loses and leaves office. And I think Trumpism is not going to die that
Yeah.
easily. I think it's hard to imagine, but some of Trump's kids are pretty keen to run. I mean, we think that sounds crazy and horrible, but we didn't think Trump was going to win, did we? So here we are. Donald Trump Jr. particularly. And barring an utter landslide destruction of Trump at the ballot box, which is possible, there's still going to be a sizable proportion of Americans who support him. 30%, 40%. It's not a small minority of people. That's a lot of people who support. It may not be necessarily in the future moving forward Donald Trump, so it ends up being someone else who represents it. And to be honest, where Trump failed miserably, and I think and I hope he'll lose the election because of this, he actually ended up being just incompetent. Like he's actually a pretty bad autocrat wannabe. The danger is someone who's much more efficient and better at the job, so to speak. That's the danger. So someone like again, I don't like these people, but someone like a Mike Pence or Tom Cotton, people like this who are hard right, not stupid, I suspect would be far more competent than Trump. From all reports, Trump just doesn't take interest in stuff. His attention span is like a 3-year-old. I mean, he's just not interested in the issue. And the impact of COVID has just shown that the government literally just walked away. I mean, just insane negligence. Mm-hmm. The worry is that the next person will do a lot of the similar policies, but do it much more ruthlessly and effectively. That to me is the danger. In 2024, 2020, whether it's Trump's kids or someone else, that's what worries me.
Yeah. Now, I've heard you speak a lot about like the far right in Europe and how like cunning and smart they are, but that's probably a conversation for another time. So I just want to
be
say,
clear, just for people to viewers, not because I support them.
No.
Yes, cunning in terms of, I presume you're referring there to how they may address climate change.
Exactly.
Maybe referring to that. Yes. Yeah, a conversation another time. But yeah, so yes, I'm utterly opposed to the far right.
No, I didn't want to get that mixed up. Of course you are, and so am I. But thank you so much for coming on as my second guest
pleasure.
And speaking to me about Israel and Palestine.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Nick.
No worries. Thank you.